Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the passage from 2 Timothy. It says that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. And really the context of this passage, why I brought it up, it's really brings up a problem of the modern age, especially. And even in Paul's day, it's interesting, and that's really the relevance of the Old Testament, because a lot of aspects of the New Testament, they can be a bit vague when it comes to policy and certain kinds of doctrines and things in the church, especially disciplinary things. People talk about love and grace, and they want something that's ultra permissive. And the Old Testament really clarify. I mean, things that Paul doesn't cover directly, the Old Testament can really clarify a lot of things. And so the passage, this passage is actually used a lot to just illustrate why the Bible itself is worthwhile to be used. But the context of it is actually explicitly about why the Old Testament is worthwhile, because when these two passages were written, the New Testament itself was currently being written by the different authors at the different times. And it would be actually 3 centuries roughly before it was even canonized to actually be Scripture. They were referred to things like letters and gospels and stuff like that, the writings. And it was only the Old Testament that had been canonized for centuries that is actually called Scripture. And so a lot of people, there's just a very common problem, people denying that a lot of things in the Old Testament just aren't relevant, they're obsolete. And so that is something to keep in mind. And part of, in terms of theology, one way to put things into perspective, years ago, Rick Godwin on TBN, when I was watching, he sort of gave a theological paradigm that I guess came from the Baptists, but strangely enough, while a lot of things, I'm a sacramental Christian and that believes in liturgy and other things like that, which wouldn't have a lot of things in common with Baptists. But this is one of these few things where what he mentioned was actually really perfect as far as describing all of Christianity. And for lack of a term, I'm just going to call this the cross-filter paradigm. And the basic idea that is put forward is that basically all the Old Testament is in play, but what it is there's kind of a rule, and that's that think of it like sunlight or something, whether it's water or something. I like to think of it in terms of light, but the Old Testament shines out and it's put through the filter of the cross, and basically things from the New Testament that relate to that, like the different church councils that they had where the apostles discussed things, and of course the epistles and things like that. And so what happens is all the Old Testament is in play except for things that are specifically dealt with by the cross, or by implication by those different epistles and other writings that come from the New Testament. So in other words, what that means is that things like blood sacrifice are obviously dealt with, and things like the need for, let's say, a Gentile to follow the Mosaic law, that was explicitly dealt with in that Acts 15 council. But basically, other things are in play as far as informing how we think of things and how we do things. And so what that brings up, but the interesting thing about this is that many people that will claim a paradigm like that, they can start to assume a lot more things than are directly done. So let's say a good example of this is something like tithing, for instance. Um, now, tithing, I don't think it's absolutely mandated, but some people are very anti-tithing, that it's like moral, almost immorally wrong. In the New Testament, we actually have a standard where people often went well beyond tithing. They would give up large portions of their goods to the church. But um, to reference St. Paul, I forget what part of the epistles, but he refers to the law. There's different terms for the law that I think it's a pedagogue, or there's another term where the law is a kind of, it's either there's one term that references a slave that would take like a preschool or like a kindergartner person, that would lead that person to go to school so they would learn how to read and write. Or there's another term I heard too that is possibly referenced, that it has to do with the grammar, that in the way that we practice our ABCs and stuff like that. Kids were given the sample of what the alphabet was, and they're supposed to trace all those letters out, and that's how they learned good and evil. And the law is also looked at that way. But anyway, the law essentially does inform us on things. So, for instance, on tithing, um, tithing really is a good example of like proper stewardship, um, on like what you should be thinking of doing as a Christian and things like that. And oh, another example is on worship. Lots of people assume that within the New Testament we really don't have a standard for worship, but that's not quite true. People often assume with the temple being over that everything there is obsolete, but if you look in actually Judaism, really essentially the worship of the tabernacle and temple was sort of is like a paradigm or a tradition, but actually a guide, I guess you could say. It was this paradigm guide on how to worship. And that is actually true in Christianity. So a lot of people that are against some of these liturgies, forms like the Mass and other things that are like the Mass, are wrong, basically. If they see that as unspiritual. Not only was it a guide, but here's the thing. This is a form of worship that God actually instituted, but even beyond that, the tabernacle was itself a copy of something that is done in heaven, and the heavenly worship has been going on for aeons. Um, anyway, the idea that it would be obsolete, obviously, if it's done in heaven, it should be done here below on earth. And anyway, besides that, I would just get into the philosophical nature of how we do things in the church, and it really mirrors society in a way. Government, for instance, operates under precedent, and that's how we do law. That's how our Constitution works. That's how society has worked for thousands of years, and really the same thing goes in the church. And even though we're under like a new wineskin, a new covenant, that new wineskin, a new covenant, is still informed by the old covenant. And there's a couple examples, but I would say, like Paul, really the best example of this. Paul's use of when people are being contentious about him being compensated or just being, like nasty about things like that. he reaches into Deuteronomy 25:9, the passage about muzzling the ox, and he takes that as a principle why ministers of the gospel are rightly compensated. And he does that in two places of the New Testament. Another example, it actually is the church hierarchy. Lots of people think that the system, they blame it as a Catholic pagan system, but the idea that you've got these bishops, priests, and deacons, and they might say, where in the Bible is that, and all this stuff like that. But that system, really, it comes from the Old Testament, and it's an outgrowth of basically what God was doing in the Old Testament, and it was brought forward, and that is going to be a topic I'll deal with later. But just one little key, we'll just talk about the ministry of the deacon, for instance. That's often assumed. When I read Protestant writings on that, it just seemed like it came across when they brought in the deacons in the book of Acts. It came across kind of like that scene in, I don't know if it's Deuteronomy, but Moses, Exodus, I believe, yeah. Moses is working himself to death, and his father-in-law Jethro visits him, and he sees how he's working him to death, and so he basically coaches him to start giving out responsibilities to other people, and it's usually thought of that as a practical way, but that's not really true. For the deacon itself, the deacon came, excuse me, the deacon came from the synagogal system of the shomash. And the shomash was the rabbinical assistant. But, you know, the shomash itself was an invention because the shomash was actually directly inspired and based on the Old Testament Levite. And because he'd be an assistant, and he would do things like the Levite would do, taking care of the synagogue and all the sacred stuff to the synagogue, the books and all the whatever they have with the synagogue. And so, anyway, no, that did not come. That was not just an improvised solution to something. That was taken from the older system, and the apostles adopted it directly in the book of Acts. Well, I've got a lot more to say on this topic. At some point, I'd like to talk about the charismatic movement and revelation, because a lot of times people want to claim something as just revelation and it's unquestioned, and there's certain problems with that. Even if it doesn't look, things don't look exactly bad, sometimes things can kind of get weird. And also, when it comes to like revivals and imitating other ministers, this sort of thing can apply, that people can try to establish what this one minister did as some kind of ironclad law that we have to do this to be successful. So anyway, there's going to be more in the future on this kind of topic. And anyway, thanks for tuning in, and please like and share, and I will talk to you later on another topic. Bye-bye.